Hello, greetings and welcome to this video on the factors behind the end of apartheid. Well, the factors really behind the National Party entering into negotiations with the ANC in the first place, and then secondly on actually agreeing to negotiate into apartheid. What were the factors, what were the pressures that led to that outcome? So it's actually quite sad for me to be making this video at this point, because I'd normally be doing revision classes on this topic at this time of year, and I miss teaching this stuff. I miss my students and our discussions, and there's so much fascinating detail in this topic that brings the whole thing to life that we'd normally be discussing in class, but I've had to leave much of it out of the lecture or it'll just be too long. It's probably far too long anyway. I hope I've struck roughly the right balance between brevity and detail, and I hope you'll enjoy it and find it useful. And best of luck to you all in year 13 who are sitting the exam this year. I think it's on the 20th of May for those of you doing edXL. I'll be thinking of you all, and those of you in year 12 doing internal exams on this stuff as well, of course. One love and good luck to you all. Okay, now before we get started, just a few words on making notes. I suggest you use the headings and subheadings I provided in the video description to structure your notes. I generally recommend listening to a chunk, just listening, making notes in your head, mental notes. Oh, that's the key thing, remember that. And then pause the video and then make your notes. Maybe at the end of kind of each subheading, that's a good way to do it. Some people prefer to make notes as you go along. I think the danger of making notes as you go along is you're noting down everything probably too much, and you're noting down things before you've actually seen kind of the full picture and really understood, okay, what's really relevant and what's the most significant thing and so on. So that's what I'd recommend. Look at the subheadings, think, okay, this section on the MK, I'll listen to this whole section on the MK, just listening, making mental notes, then I'll pause the video, then I'll write up a few bullet points based on the most significant things from that. Okay, so where are we? Just going back to my notes here. Yeah, you definitely don't need to capture everything that I'm going to say here in this video. I'm going to give quite a bit of context and background to the various elements that we discuss here, which you wouldn't really particularly need to do in an essay, which was solely focused on the end of apartheid. And the reason I'm doing that is really just to show you how the previous aspects of the course and the kind of earlier events in the history kind of fit into the end of apartheid and fit into the issues that we're looking at today. So, introduction. Okay, so of course any good introduction should of course define any key terms in the question. So in this case, apartheid. The term apartheid is of course an Afrikaans word which literally means separateness, and it refers to really any system of official racialized discrimination in which people's citizenship rights are dependent on their ethnicity. That's how I would define it. There are different definitions available. Make sure you choose yours, learn it, because there will for sure be an opportunity to use it in the exam. So apartheid is a system, for example, applied today by the Israelis to the Palestinians, but it's according to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. That's the term they've used to describe that situation. But it's also most commonly associated with the period of National Party rule in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. Now, the technical answer to this question, why did apartheid end, is that really apartheid ended for two reasons. Firstly, because de Klerk's National Party repealed most of the apartheid laws between 1990 and 1994. And secondly, because negotiations between the ANC and the National Party and through the COSATU negotiations and so on led to an agreement to hold elections on, important phrase here, a universal adult franchise, which basically means all adults get to vote, regardless of their ethnicity, etc. So the National Party agreed to hold elections on a universal adult franchise, in other words, to abolish the white monopoly on voting for a national parliament. The ANC then won that election, came to power, and abolished the last remnants of apartheid, for example, by abolishing the separate homeland governments. But that's just the technical answer. In other words, that really tells us how apartheid ended, but not really why. Why did de Klerk and the National Party agree to negotiate with the ANC in the first place? Actually, negotiation originally began under de Klerk's predecessor, Botha. And why did they eventually agree to an end to apartheid? Now, this lecture will argue that apartheid ultimately ended because there was no longer any way it could be sustained. And this in turn was due to, you can see it almost like a pincer movement of, on the one hand, international pressure from the National Party's erstwhile allies, in particular the US, and on the other, from the resistance movements across southern Africa, particularly within South Africa itself. And I'm going to argue that above all, it was the township uprisings that began in 1984-85, led not by politicians or activists or political parties, by ordinary working class, often unemployed black youth in the townships, that was really the fundamental cause of the unraveling of the apartheid system, and actually a cause of the international pressure and sanctions in the first place in many ways. So let's begin then with what was happening within South Africa itself that was putting pressure on the National Party to end apartheid. Domestic pressure, anti-apartheid resistance within South Africa itself. And here there are 4 elements I want to discuss. So pause the video here, a little bit of revision for you, and see what different groups or events you can name that were part of the anti-apartheid resistance inside South Africa in the 1980s. Okay, did you do it? So the 4 elements I want to look at are, hopefully you got at least a few of these. The MK, Umkhonto we Sizwe, that's the ANC's armed wing. Well, technically we call it the ANC's armed wing, and it's fine to refer to it as that in your essays. Technically, if you remember when it was founded in 1961, it was founded not as the official armed wing of the ANC, but as a kind of separate independent organization, although it was founded by leading members of the ANC and the South African Communist Party. And if you remember, the reason it was not officially designated as the armed wing of ANC, but was given this kind of technically separate existence, is because the ANC was split over whether to launch armed struggle and to set up an armed wing in the first place. In fact, ANC president at the time, Albert Luthuli, was actually against creating an armed wing. So Nelson Mandela and the others who were in support of armed struggle at that point, along with members of the South African Communist Party, decided they would actually take the initiative to set up Umkhonto we Sizwe themselves. But it's generally seen as the ANC's armed wing because so many leading members of the ANC were also leading members of the MK. Okay, slight technicality I just thought I'd point out. Okay, so the 4 elements, the MK. The UDF, the United Democratic Front, founded in 1983. The trade unions, in particular COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, founded in 1985. And in my opinion, most importantly, as I said, the township uprisings beginning 84-85. So, first of all, the MK, Umkhonto, their armed struggle. Remember, MK had largely been crushed inside the country following Vorster's successful crackdown in the 1960s, and especially following the Rivonia raid and subsequent trial in 1963-64. So they slowly re-emerged during the 1970s, but one thing that made a huge difference and massively swelled the ranks of their fighters in 1976 was, well, what was it? What happened in 1976 that led a huge number of young people to flee the country, and in fact 4,000 of them ending up in MK training camps in Angola and elsewhere. Pause the video. Did you get it? That's right. I'm of course talking about the Soweto uprising. And the crackdown that followed the Soweto uprising in 1976 saw thousands of young people flee the country to evade capture by the state authorities, with 4,000 ending up in MK training camps in neighbouring countries. And so in the 1980s then, MK was able to begin serious military operations within South Africa again for the first time in 20 years, using all of these, this newly trained thousands of fighters. But unlike, it's an interesting example there of, how repression often actually bolsters resistance rather than crushing it. But unlike their campaign in the 1960s, as I said, they now had thousands of fighters, well-trained and well-equipped with support from Cuba, the Soviet Union, Algeria, Libya, and other radical anti-colonial governments. Another difference is that whereas when they first launched in 1961, they did not target people, right? Only buildings and infrastructure, industrial sabotage, they called that campaign of 61 to 63. But now, by the 1980s, they actually began targeting the security forces themselves, police, army, and so on, as well as their collaborators, including within the black community itself. So military and police bases were attacked with bombs, rifles, mortars, and RPGs relentlessly throughout the decade, as well as softer targets such as banks by the second half of the decade. However, despite the regularity of attacks, I would argue the primary significance of these attacks was not military. It wasn't so much that it created a serious military pressure or was ever really a serious military threat to the South African army within South Africa, but was more symbolic, right? Functioning as what Chris Hani, leading MK and ANC member and South African Communist Party member as well, actually, what he called armed propaganda. Now, what these attacks did is that they showed that resistance was still alive. They boosted the morale of the oppressed masses, showing them that they could hit back against their oppressors. And thus they inspired people to join the underground movement and fed into a broad culture of resistance that was growing amongst the black masses in South Africa. They helped to create, a lot in resistance movements and struggle and so on. A lot of it's about, narrative, creating a popular mythology, by which I don't mean made up just lies. I mean a kind of story, a story of who we are. And the MK's actions helped to feed into this narrative growing amongst black people, particularly in the townships, but also in the homelands, that we are a resistant people. That's part of our identity, right? So that obviously that feeds into a kind of general atmosphere that it's right to resist, and people taking risks to confront the state and so on. At the same time, these attacks also contained a message for white people that they would not enjoy that white people would not enjoy security so long as black people were denied their rights. And that's the meaning of the slogan that became common on many demonstrations throughout the world at this time. You may have heard it even on demonstrations these days: no justice, no peace, which simply means if we don't get justice, you're not going to get any peace. And so the attacks of the MK led to a polarization of white society, which increasingly split into those seeking to reach an accommodation with the ANC, represented, for example, by the Progressive Federal Party, a negotiated end to apartheid to stop the resistance that way, and those who simply sought to wipe out the resistance, wipe out the MK and all other forms of resistance, who were relying increasingly on military repression for the overall government of South Africa. And this position was increasingly represented by, well, pause the video, but Revision Who, which was the party mainly representing that hardline approach. That's right, as the Conservative Party, which had split from the National Party in 1982 in opposition to both its reforms, such as the tricameral parliament. The National Party themselves, under both Botha and from 1999 under de Klerk, were effectively trying to do both these things at once, both the repression and the kind of reform and negotiation and so on. And remember, Botha's total strategy was exactly this: a combination of increased militarization of South African government, along with an increasingly aggressive attitude to those of its neighbours who supported the ANC, regularly bombing its neighbouring countries and so on if they hosted ANC bases and so on, at the same time as attempting some reforms, albeit largely but not completely tokenistic. The tricameral parliament was the most obvious one of these in 1983, but these reforms of both also included the effective scrapping of pass laws from 1986, for example. They basically stopped trying to enforce the pass laws after 1986, so that was big. The classic example of, in kind of one instant, if you like, of Botha's combination of both repression and reform that's kind of emblematic of this total strategy was in 1985. So here's a little revision question to you. What was the offer that Botha made to Mandela in 1985? Pause the video and say it out loud. It helps you remember stuff if you say it out loud. Do you remember? That's right. Botha offered to release Mandela from prison so long as Mandela renounced the armed struggle. And pause the video here and tell me, what was Mandela's response to that offer? That's right. He rejected it. And there's a beautiful video of Mandela's daughter reading out Mandela's rejection letter to a rally in Soweto. I'll post a link to it in the video description, I remember. But if I don't, you can easily look that up. It's worth watching. So what Botha did to respond to Mandela's rejection of his offer was he did two things. He ordered the bombing of ANC bases in 3 countries, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and in Botswana. But then at the same time, he actually authorized talks between the apartheid government and the ANC in exile, and actually allowed Mandela out prison for a few hours to meet the Minister of Justice. So this perfectly illustrates the National Party's strategy throughout the 1980s, which was to try to simultaneously ramp up militarism and repression, to deal with the resistance that way, whilst also trying to negotiate with the ANC and pass some reforms and so on. So the MK's military campaign helped to keep up the pressure to say, hey, you're going to have to deal with us. Don't think that there's a way to peacefully implement apartheid. There's going to be consequences, and they're not going anywhere. And so it was part of what forced white people to start to realize they were never going to be able to live in peace so long as apartheid continued. So that's the MK. So my suggestion to you in terms of note-taking is pause the video now and just jot down some notes on the MK. I think for each of these factors, the thing to really just kind of jot down just a few bullet points under each of these two headings is the kind of details, like what were the MK doing, what was happening, details, stuff like that. I'm going to post a timeline of key MK attacks as well. It might be worth learning one or two specific attacks to give us an example, if you like. And then secondly, what was the significance? What was the significance of each of these factors? So I've just gone into that for the MK, about this sort of significance in terms of the impact on black people, inspiration, encouraging a culture of resistance, and for white people, this kind of message that there will be no security and peace for white people so long as apartheid continues. For me, that's the kind of significance, and then that led to this pressure and this split in white society, and this pressure to do something to somehow deal with this issue, whether it's through repression or reform. But obviously there was a push, significant section of white society now pushing for some sort of negotiated end to apartheid as well, partly as a result of MK's armed struggle. Okay, so that's what I suggest you do at the end of each of these little factors. Just key details, key facts, significance, make a few bullet points under each. Okay, so second domestic factor putting pressure on the apartheid government to end apartheid was the UDF, the United Democratic Front, established in 1983, a united front of organizations seeking an end to apartheid. It was made up of all kinds of civil society organizations, what we call civil society organizations, including church groups, student groups, residents associations, even sports clubs and things like that. Groups that you might not necessarily think of as always being kind of big P political. And in many ways it can be seen as the fruition of many years of struggle and experience, because the leadership of the UDF, really interesting if you look, who was actually in the leadership, it brought together really four groups from four different decades, really, kind of four generations of strugglers, if you like. So it brought together the veterans of the mass campaigns of the 1950s, some of the leaders from the Defiance campaign and so on, veterans of the armed struggle of the early 60s, many of them only recently out of prison, former leaders of the Black Consciousness movement of the 70s, and remember many of whom had actually become more influenced by the ANC, again in prison in the late 70s often, and then as well as younger activists mobilized by, after Soweto there was a kind of groundswell of community organizing, often but not always pushed by the BCM, that followed the Soweto uprising of 1976. So it really was a united campaign bringing together these different political strands, as well as different generations of activists, all bringing their experience of different aspects of the struggle. So it wasn't solely an ANC front, although the ANC was very supportive of it, and many of its leaders were seen as charterist, useful phrase there, charterist, that is people who are supportive of the ANC's Freedom Charter. You remember that they drew up in 1955. And the UDF, by the way, did eventually actually officially endorse the Freedom Charter. It didn't at the start because it wanted to be seen as, kind of more broader than just an ANC thing. But it did go on to officially endorse the Freedom Charter once actually the ANC's credibility had become so high, really, amongst all the different political elements, that it was seen that it wouldn't really alienate many people anyway to endorse the Charter. So the ANC's, and just a little digression here, but I think it's interesting to understand how the ANC's tactics and understanding was changing at this time. The ANC's support for the UDF and their role in its creation was partly influenced, I think, by the ANC's visit to Vietnam. Now, Vietnam had, of course, defeated the USA in 1975, and this was incredible significance throughout the whole of what was then called the Third World, the Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where 8% of the world's population live and had been formerly colonized by the European powers. And so hugely inspirational, the Vietnamese victory, where, you know, the mighty nuclear power of USA was defeated and humbled by you know, a group of peasants basically, who were whose supply lines were run by people in flip-flops on bicycles. So it's an incredibly powerful message for the whole world, really, that, you know, no matter where you are in the kind of economic or racial hierarchy that's imposed on the world by the West and Europe and the USA, you know, you can still fight and win. So and the victory in Vietnam was largely masterminded by the Vietnamese Communist General Giap. I think it's GIAP. So in 1978, the ANC sent a delegation, a high-level delegation of their leaders, to meet him in Vietnam and see what lessons they could learn for their own struggle. Now, this is really interesting because the ANC delegation, I think, had probably expected to learn all kinds of military strategy and technique and tactics, but that wasn't actually what Giap and his comrades emphasized at all. Instead, what they argued had been crucial to their victory was not this or that military technique, but rather the constant emphasis on what was called mass struggle and people's war. So that visit, in a way, finally convinced the ANC leadership of what Chris Hani and his comrades had been trying to convince them of for the best part of the last decade, since the Hani Memorandum of 1970, which was that the revolution had to be the work of the masses themselves. It couldn't just be an elite struggle conducted by, you know, paramilitary force on their behalf. So Giap's strategy emphasized the need for what he called mass work, bringing ordinary people into the struggle in their millions. And in particular, he argued for the crucial need for legal and what he intriguingly called semi-legal activity, so that ordinary people could get involved in confronting the apartheid regime in their millions. And he also emphasized the need to join to the struggle everyone who was against apartheid, even if they didn't support the ANC or they were opposed to the armed struggle. If they were against apartheid, you need some formation to bring them in, to allow them to actually be part of that mass effort pushing back against the government. So he really emphasized to the ANC the need for a unified mass movement of everyone against apartheid. And so the UDF really offered the opportunity to do this, and the ANC enthusiastically supported it, even though the UDF itself was independent from the ANC and included leaders such as Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who were ideologically and tactically at odds to some extent with the ANC and certainly with the MK. And what the UDF did, which was so important in my opinion, was two things. Firstly, it created a whole network of neighborhood organizations fighting for everyday improvements in people's lives. So like I say, after Soweto, there was this groundswell of these community organizations building up already, but the UDF really developed and intensified that kind of movement and brought them all together as well. So these neighborhood kind of committees would campaign on things, basic everyday things, bus prices, rent levels, things like that. And they were often able to win these local campaigns. And as their strength and reach amongst the grassroots grew, grassroots we just mean basically ordinary people on the block, as opposed to the highfalutin politicians and so on, their reach amongst the grassroots grew. They were then able to draw these people into wider political struggle. And that enabled them to achieve what I believe was the second significant development resulting from the UDF, which was that the UDF effectively reinvigorated the mass civil disobedience aspect of the struggle, which hadn't really been seen since the early 60s with the Pass Laws campaign. So in 1989, for example, despite being banned that year, they organized 1989, did I say 69? In 1989, despite being banned that year, the UDF organized a second defiance campaign, consciously echoing the defiance campaign of 1952, which, like the earlier defiance campaign, involved mass breaches of apartheid laws on racial segregation. So black people en masse went into white-only beaches, white-only buses, presented themselves for treatment at white-only hospitals, and so on. Because there were so many people involved, the police were unable to arrest and prosecute everyone. And so arguably the second defiance campaign actually achieved what the 1952 defiance campaign had been largely unable to achieve, which was that these petty apartheid laws were effectively being made unworkable. And it's notable that most of those laws, Separation of Amenities Act and so on, were then abandoned in de Klerk's first wave of reforms the following year, in 1990. Okay, so that's the UDF, their significance, the community organization, the mass civil disobedience. Again, all kind of working to bring huge numbers of people into the struggle and making apartheid start to become unenforceable on some levels. Okay, third domestic resistance aspect of domestic resistance I want to look at is the unions, the trade unions. And first, a bit of history. So there were segregated unions, and again, I'm going to go into a bit of detail here to clarify a few things. Go into a bit of the history before the 80s, which just to make sure that there's no misunderstandings and things like that. But you don't need to make notes on all of this. But there were segregated unions throughout the apartheid era. Separate trade unions for whites, for Indians, for black people, and for the group labelled as coloured. Now, just to go into this term for a moment, because this is often the cause of some confusion. Remember the use of the term coloured, and that was an official in the government documents, would be on your passbook, ethnicity coloured. It was one of the 4 official ethnicities used to separate people and award them different rights in the apartheid era. And the use of this term coloured in apartheid South Africa was quite different to how it has been used historically, usually in a racist way here in Britain. So I'm going to clarify this a little bit. So remember, the use of that term coloured in apartheid South Africa was basically used as a catch-all term for anyone who is of mixed heritage or really any ethnic origin other than white European, black African or Indian, and also included, for example, what were called Malay people. The Malay people were Muslims who'd come from Dutch colonies such as Indonesia during the time when both South Africa and Indonesia were colonized by the Dutch. The term coloured also included the surviving members of the indigenous peoples of the Cape, such as the Khoikhoi and the San Bushmen. So the term was, as used in apartheid South Africa, it's a bit different to the way that it's been used in Britain, where historically it's been basically a racist term to refer to everyone except white Europeans, right? So in apartheid South Africa, the term did not include black Africans and Indians, who were seen as separate racial categories, but was seen as a separate group comprising basically everyone else who wasn't purely white, black African or Indian heritage. So I just wanted to clarify that, because it can often be the cause of some confusion. And basically just remember that in the South African context, coloured was a separate category from black and from Indian, and obviously from white. So I hope that's clear, because like I say, it's often kind of cause of some confusion because of it means something different historically in Britain to how it was used in apartheid South Africa. Okay, so the unions, each of the 4 racial categories that operated in apartheid South Africa had to have their own separate unions, and under the terms of the Native Labour Act of 1953, the black unions were basically barred from doing most of the normal union activities, including collective bargaining, which is when workers collectively agree a wage with their employer as a workforce, rather than just negotiating whatever they can as an individual, so everyone gets paid the same. Or, the same for different skill levels, whatever. There's kind of set rates. And most importantly, well, pause the video and just think, what is the ultimate weapon, if you like, wielded by a trade union? What is the thing they can do to really force their employer to listen to them? Pause the video and see if you can remember or work it out. What might a union do collectively with all its members to force their employer to listen to them and give them what they want? Okay? Did you do it? That's right. Going on strike. So the black trade unions were barred from going on strike and from collective bargaining, and these 2 things, going on strike and collective bargaining, are basically the 2 most basic fundamental union activities from which trade unions get their strength. So black trade unions were legal, but they were basically banned from doing any of the normal things that trade unions do, and so they were therefore largely powerless. And actually, because these basic trade union activities were banned for black people, there was actually a popular misconception that black trade unions themselves were illegal, and so very few black people were even in a union. Now that all began to change in the early 1970s, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because I think that the significance of this moment is not really emphasized enough, in my opinion, in your textbooks, but is actually really crucial to understand how apartheid ultimately ended. So remember that the decade between 1963 and 1973 was largely considered a quote-unquote quiet decade in terms of resistance. There was nothing like the mass civil disobedience that had characterized the previous decade, which included the 1952 Defiance Campaign, the 1955 Congress of the Peoples, the 1960 Pass Laws Campaign, or the early wave of MK attacks after its launch in 1961. Remember that the Rivonia Raid of 1963 and the Rivonia trial that followed it, in which 17 leading members of the ANC and MK were arrested and given life sentences, had effectively decapitated the resistance movement, stripping it of its leadership. And Vorster, as Minister of Justice initially, had created a network of informers, which had actually given him the intelligence that led to the Rivonia Raid, and it greatly expanded police powers and repression. And then combined with an economic boom, which saw employment drop and living standards rise, even for black workers, albeit from a very low base, this all meant that resistance was effectively quelled during this period. Most active leaders of the movement on both a local and national level were either in prison or in exile or banished to far-flung parts of the country. The MK's Operation Nickel in 1967 had ended in failure, at least on a military level. Just to remind you, Operation Nickel, aka the Wankie Campaign, was an attempt to infiltrate South Africa from the MK base in Zambia by creating a supply line through Rhodesia, today's Zimbabwe. Now, a so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? Again, the link with Vietnam. Now, Chris Hani had argued that the operation nevertheless had a positive effect as a propaganda action, as a piece of armed propaganda, as he called it, keeping the flag of resistance flying and lifting the spirits of oppressed people. The MK fighters had, after all, engaged the enemy in battle, Rhodesian security forces in this case, inflicted significant losses on the Rhodesian army, and at least one of the MK units managed to successfully evade capture and escape the country without being defeated in battle. But there was no escaping the fact it was a military failure, failed to achieve its military goal, creating a supply line into South Africa, and it highlighted the MK's inability to conduct operations on South African soil following the Rivonia Raid. So, but that quiet decade, lacking resistance inside the country, that ended in 1973, when mass resistance returned with a revengeance in the form of the Durban strikes. So, the background to the Durban strikes was actually a series of dockers' strikes between 1969 and 1972. A global economic slowdown had begun in the late 1960s, and this was leading to wage or cuts in what are called real wages, the amount of actually goods that you can purchase with your wages, and growing unemployment. So workers' unrest was growing, and some of these dockers' strikes had some measure of success, led to pay rises and so on. And so, partly inspired by that, in January 1973, a strike broke out initially at the Coronation Brick Factory in Durban, inspired by the dockers movement. Now remember, because these were black workers involved, all of these strikes were illegal. But nevertheless, they were solid. You know, they were well supported. The Coronation Brick workers were paid appallingly, and in their strike, they actually demanded a tripling of wages. But interestingly, they refused to elect a leadership to negotiate with the management, because they knew that any leader would immediately be arrested, because it was legal to organize a strike and it was legal to collective bargain. So this actually created a problem for the bosses, for the management, because it was hard for them to negotiate an end to the strike because there was no one for them to negotiate with. So these strikes quickly developed a multiracial element as Indian workers joined the strike as well. The bosses, the management had hoped to bring in Indian workers to replace the striking black workers, a kind of divide and rule kind of mechanism, but the Indian workers refused to scab. Scab is a word used in the trade union movement, which basically just means breaking a strike, working during a strike. The strikers didn't get their tripling of pay, but they did win a 40% pay increase, so obviously pretty significant. The strikes quickly spread throughout Durban and had soon reached 150 factories. Around 100,000 black African and Indian workers had taken part in these strikes by the end of the year, and the vast majority of them were successful and had resulted in significant increases in pay. Now, the significance of the Durban strikes is huge. It reignited civil disobedience after a decade of quiet, and it inspired and gave confidence to a whole generation of young workers. And the strikes fed into the growing black consciousness movement and also fed into the militancy that gave rise to the Soweto uprising in 1976. But most importantly, it gave birth to a black trade union movement that went on to play a fundamental role in ending apartheid. So one of the things the strikes did, as I hinted at earlier, was that they created a situation where South Africa's labour laws were actually hindering the ability of employers to contain labour unrest. And this was because anyone coming forward as a leader to negotiate with the employer for an end to the strike could be breaking the apartheid laws against collective bargaining and striking, so leaders could be arrested. So it became difficult, as I said, for management to negotiate an end to any strike. So to break out of this impasse, in 1973 itself, as the strikes began to spread, the National Party government actually passed an amendment to the 1953 Native Labour Act, which actually legalised strikes by black African workers for the first time in 3 decades. And this was the first time any apartheid law had been amended or reversed by pressure of mass action. The colour bar had been lifted in the construction industry during the 1960s, but that wasn't because of any mass action. That was because of the economic reality. There was economic boom. They needed more construction workers. So this was the first time that an apartheid law had been amended under pressure of mass action, and it demonstrated to the workers that they could challenge those laws and win. So psychologically, this was of huge significance, proving to the workers that they could take on the apartheid state and they could win. Then in 1977, the Wiehan Commission, this W-I-E-H-A-H-N Commission, was established by the government to look into the labour laws. And in 1979, it recommended that black trade unions be given legal recognition by the state, meaning they'd be officially consulted by government and employers in matters of employment, wages, and so on. And this was then actually implemented in law in the 1980 Labour Relations Act. And so it effectively ended the ban on collective bargaining and brought the black trade unions into a more formal relationship with employers and the state, giving them more power than they had before. So just pause the video here a second and consider this. Why do you think the virulently racist National Party government agreed to pass a law granting legal recognition to these new radical black trade unions? Have a think. Did you do it? Well, what they hoped was that bringing these radical unions more systematically into a relationship with employers in the state, they'll be more able to effectively control them, to pacify them and reduce their militancy. Needless to say, it didn't really work, as we shall see. Now, rewinding a little bit, many new unions had been formed during the strike wave of 1973, and these went on to form a new alliance of independent black and Indian unions called COSATU, the F-O-S-A-T-U, the Federation of South African Trade Unions in 1979. And this grew and evolved into an even bigger formation, COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, formed in 1985. And COSATU represented over 3 million black and Indian workers. And COSATU, so all of that really up till now, that's kind of background, but I just think it's important background. And especially if you get an essay question on, on that period that includes 1973, always mention the Durban strikes, really, really significant. Because like I said, it was this reigniting mass resistance, reversing actually apartheid law for the first time in the case of the amendment to the Native Labour Act, and then laying the basis for this trade union movement that actually went on to play a fundamental role in ending apartheid. So let's look at that then in the 1980s. How did that happen? So COSATU were able to organise strikes, or stayaways as they called them, of millions of workers that brought South Africa to a standstill. So you can see that the leap period, 1973, is really significant, but it was mainly in Durban, about 100,000 people involved. You're talking 2.5, 3 million people involved in strikes organised by COSATU by the late 80s. And these strikes, the other significant thing, not just their size, but they were not necessarily only about paying conditions. They were political strikes calling for an end to the apartheid system itself. And because of the influence the ANC had within COSATU, this gave the ANC a very strong position in the negotiations that began in 1985 and particularly got underway in the late 80s. So remember, at the same time as COSATU's mass strikes against apartheid, you had the UDF conducting mass civil disobedience against the apartheid laws. The past laws, as I said, have become effectively unenforceable by the mid-80s, leading to the National Party government repealing them in 86, effectively. And by the late 80s, petty apartheid had largely become unenforceable as well. So now you had a situation where, even though on paper all the powers with the white government and none with the black majority, the reality on the ground was very different. The apartheid government could not even enforce many of its own laws, whilst the ANC through COSATU could bring the country to a halt any time just by calling a strike. So just try and get your mind around this. The government's orders very often were being neither obeyed nor enforced, whereas the ANC, an illegal organisation, could issue orders that would be widely followed throughout the country. So this raised the question, who is really in control of the country actually? And obviously this gave huge leverage to the ANC during negotiations. And because the National Party and its international allies knew that the chaos in the country that was threatening white power and investment could only be ended with ANC support. Okay, so now we come, I see we're 40 minutes in now. We've only done the first of the three factors. This is by far the domestic one, by far the longest section, by the way. They do say that 40 minutes is generally the optimum time to concentrate for. Generally, probably differs between different people. So you might want to take a break, or you might want to just listen to this last fourth element of domestic pressure and then take a break. Up to you. Anyway, now we come to the fourth and, in my opinion, most important element of domestic resistance, the township revolt. Now just pause the video a second and remind yourself, what were the townships? Did you do it? That's right. The townships were the urban areas, areas and cities, in which black people were allowed to live. Remember, under the Group Areas Act of 1950, every inch of South Africa was divided into areas where only certain ethnicities could live, right? And just a bit of revision, remember that the ultimate goal of apartheid was that all black people would ultimately live in one of the homelands, which is the rural areas, right, in the countryside, reserved for black people under the various Native Land Acts. Similar in some ways to the Native American reservations in the USA. That was the ultimate goal of apartheid, that one of these 10 homelands, which comprised between them only 13% of South African land, by the way. Remember, black Africans constituting about 80% of the population, was supposed to ultimately be living on 13% of the land. But that was the kind of supposed long-term goal of apartheid. But in the meanwhile, lost my notes here. In the meanwhile, certain parts of cities or areas just outside of cities were designated black townships, and black people were allowed to live there, but only if they met strict conditions, such as either having been born there or having lived there continuously for 10 years before apartheid, and so on. And every other black person in the country who didn't meet those criteria was supposed to live out in one of the homelands. But because there were so few jobs, there were also coloured and Indian townships as well, by the way. But because there were so few jobs in the homelands and poverty was so extreme there, by the 1980s, by the way, just as an example, even in the 70s, and poverty just got worse in the homelands throughout the 80s, but even in the 70s, the infant mortality rate in some of those homelands was 50%. It means half the babies born die before I'm not sure if it's before they're 1 or before they're 5. But they die as infants, right? Half of the infants die. So serious, extreme suffering and hardship and poverty. And so by the 80s, there were millions of people who'd moved from the homelands to the townships illegally to find work. And when they got there, they would often live in shacks or tents due to housing shortages and their own poverty. And what the apartheid government would do would be to periodically bulldoze those, what were called squatter camps, and make everyone there homeless again. And anyway, the point is, by the way, throughout the whole period of apartheid, 3.5 million people were forcibly evicted because they were deemed as living in the wrong part of the country because of their ethnicity or whatever. So it's just incredible level of hardship and suffering. And anyway, the point is the situation in the townships was growing increasingly desperate. And in 1984, a revolt kicked off in a part of the country called the Vaal Triangle, when an angry crowd attacked and killed several township councillors they viewed as collaborators. This was part of both his reform package, as well as the tricameral parliament. He created these elected township councils that were supposed to have some kind of role in how things worked in the townships, but they were largely seen as they were seen as collaborators, basically, by the ANC and by the UDF, who were kind of basically agents of the apartheid regime in the townships. So the UDF organised boycotts of the township elections and so on and so forth. So this revolt in the Vaal Triangle then spread to other townships throughout 1985. And in the same year, at the same time, the Congress of South African Students called a high school youth strike against apartheid. And the ANC called on South Africans to make the country ungovernable. That was their slogan of 1985, make the country ungovernable. And the way they communicated, by the way, the ANC, because remember, they're mainly still in exile, the ANC. They had their training camps in neighbouring countries. The Tambo, the president, was based in London, etc. So the way they tended to communicate with people inside South Africa was through, they had their own radio station that they beamed into the country, Radio Freedom. You could illicitly listen to that. And through that and other means, they put out the message, make the country ungovernable. And in 1986, a huge uprising broke out in the township of Alexandra following the shooting dead of a young black activist, Michael Diradeng, by a security guard, actually. And for 6 days, the youth in the township battled the police and burnt down shops owned by those perceived as collaborators. But even after this, the revolt continued. And as the townships continued to rise up, a situation was created where the government no longer effectively controlled those areas. And so to fill the vacuum, revolutionary-minded youth actually began to set up their own elected street committees to basically run their neighbourhoods themselves. This was known as people's power, and even included their own court system to adjudicate disputes between people without having to go to the apartheid police or courts. So really they're creating their own liberated zones, right, in the townships, outside of government control, with their own law enforcement and their own laws. So the government responded harshly, sending the army into the townships and declaring a state of emergency in July 1985. And in my opinion, this is the pivotal moment in South African politics and marks the beginning of the end of apartheid, because the state of emergency, which means basically when you basically give the police and the army powers to kind of impose military rule, basically. Initially it was in certain areas, then it was spread to the whole country in 86. And the state of emergency was really a complete admission of failure. It was the government effectively admitting that its reform program had failed. They tried to create a class of black political collaborators in the townships, but now the black population was rising up against those very collaborators. So the government could not rule by consent or pacify the people with reforms, so they had to resort to using pure force against them. But this didn't work either, and resistance was actually fueled rather than quelled by the insertion of the army into the townships. The army were attacked on every street corner by angry youths armed with rocks and Molotov cocktails. The army were rarely able to even get out of their armoured jeeps. So the National Party couldn't govern by force either. So if you can't rule by consent and you can't impose your will by force, in a way, are you really even the government? So in other words, it became clear with the state of emergency, in my opinion, that the ANC's call to make the country ungovernable had largely been achieved, at least in the townships. And this had repercussions right across the world. So, so you might want to pause there, like I say. So that's the four elements of domestic pressure. So, and I'm going to come back to the impact, the sort of how the impact of the township rebellion, as well as the other aspects of domestic pressure, the armed struggle, the unions, the strikes, the civil disobedience of the UDF, how all of that actually was that led to the international pressure. So let's now turn to our second major factor behind the end of apartheid, as I say, international pressure. Now, there had been various sporting boycotts, cultural boycotts, consumer boycotts initiated by the anti-apartheid movement in other countries ever since the early 60s. And these have been growing in strength ever since. By the 1980s, South African sports teams were ostracized from most international sports due to global repugnance at the generally white-only teams that they were fielding. So they've been banned from the Commonwealth Games, from FIFA, from the Rugby World Cup in 1987, from the ICC in cricket, amongst many other international sporting bodies and competitions. In terms of the consumer boycott, it had become, which is refusing to buy South African products at the supermarket and so on, it become taboo. And I vaguely remember this myself, although believe it or not, I was very young in the 80s. It became quite mainstream. It became almost taboo amongst many shoppers around the world to buy South African products. And checking fruit and veg to ensure they were not from South Africa became a common part of the shopping experience for ordinary people, as it's starting to become so with the kind of boycott movement against Israel today. Musicians and other performers were increasingly refusing to play South Africa as part of the cultural boycott. And yet, whilst all of this greatly helped raise awareness of the injustices of apartheid outside South Africa, it did little to change things within the country. In fact, arguably it reinforced the so-called lager mentality or siege mentality that was actually one of the main ideological props of the regime. But what did start to have a significant impact on the National Party government were the divestment, which means withdrawing your investments, the divestment and sanctions, which means actually countries making it illegal to trade with another country. So the divestment and sanctions that began in earnest from 1985. So some foreign investors, observing the chaos and unrest in the country, had already begun pulling out in 1984. Then in 1985, with the township uprising and the state of emergency it triggered, banks began to seriously fear for the country's financial stability. They began to wonder, how could an ungovernable country be able to pay off its loans? Especially it's getting into ever more and more debt, and there doesn't seem to be a way out of its crisis. So in 1985, a number of American banks actually refused to renew South Africa's loans, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, other big international financiers. And this triggered an immediate financial crisis, and the value of the South African currency, the rand, halved practically overnight, and rampant inflation followed. Now this of course simply fueled the unrest, because workers found that their meager wages could no longer cover their basic needs, right? Because of inflation. So the union movement became more militant. Remember again, that year, pivotal year, COSATU was formed to coordinate mass strike activity across different sectors. And perhaps for the first time, white living standards were now also being affected negatively by apartheid. Whites could no longer enjoy apartheid and the privileged life it gave them cost-free. Then in 1986, the unthinkable happened, right? So South Africa's biggest ally, the inspiration for its segregationist policies, seemed to abandon it. The US Congress passed a series of sanctions on the country, which makes it, like I say, illegal to actually trade in certain sectors, and it applied that to nearly all sectors. So President Reagan, interestingly, tried to veto the sanctions, but the Congress had the 2/3 majority they required to override his veto. And then in South Africa, the financial crisis deepened because they lost their main trading partner. Now, South Africa was an economy heavily reliant on trade with the West, and in particular the US, and so the loss of its biggest market, the USA, was highly significant. And to get out of its spiraling economic problems and all the political unrest that was causing, South Africa would need to win back the US. But the US was increasingly telling South Africa the only way that they would lift sanctions was if they restored stability, and the only way to restore stability was to make a deal with the ANC. So again, it was 1985 that Botha, for the first time since apartheid, instructed his government to begin official negotiations with the ANC in exile. So we can see it was really 1985 that was the key moment in South African history. But all of these momentous, even global changes, the banks pulling out, the US sanctions, the start of negotiations, had, in my opinion, one major cause, which was the black youth in the townships refusing to just accept apartheid and rising up. Because, like I say, that showed the country was actually, the government was losing its grip on the country. And so this was one of those, maybe rare, but maybe not so rare if you look at history from below, one of those moments in history when the people described by Frantz Fanon as the wretched of the earth, those designated right at the bottom of the social and economic and racial hierarchy, by the establishment, the African working class urban youth rushed the stage of world history and wrenched it into a totally different direction. And now we come to our third factor or set of factors, regional pressure, because that unrest and that resistance was not just in South Africa either. The whole of Southern Africa was ablaze against white supremacy. And of particular significance were the struggles in Angola and Namibia. Just before I go into that, a little bit of context, which is that the South Africa by the 1980s was the last kind of holdout of white supremacy. If you think when South Africa, when apartheid began in 1948, pretty much the whole of Africa, certainly the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, was basically under some kind of white supremacist rule. They were all colonized by white European powers. Whereas by the 1980s, South Africa is the last place being run by a white minority. All of the other African countries, including all the African countries on its border, have achieved independence, black majority rule. So South Africa is already completely isolated in the region. And of course, the rest of the region is very much opposed and hostile to apartheid. They see it as an abomination. But like I say, so Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, they all at certain points, gave bases to the ANC and some level of support to the ANC. The ANC was largely based in exile in Zambia through most of between the 60s and the 80s. But I want to particularly focus, like I say, on Angola and Namibia, because these were where the really most significant battles were fought in the 80s. So let's start with Namibia. There was a ferocious guerrilla struggle being waged in Namibia led by SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization. Namibia at that time was known as Southwest Africa. And Namibia, remember, was a colony of South Africa under occupation by the South African Army. And the struggle there, because the South African Army had to keep sending more and more soldiers in to try and crush SWAPO, and they were not succeeding and they were being killed and so on. So the struggle there was tying up huge numbers of South African troops and depleting the military resources they needed to then, from 85 onwards, they were starting to need to deploy in the townships within South Africa itself. Then there was Angola, and Angola had become independent from Portuguese rule in 1975 under the leadership of the black radical communist movement, really, the MPLA. And South Africa had immediately invaded following the MPLA coming to power in 75, but they'd been beaten back by the MPLA in alliance with Cuba, interestingly, who'd sent thousands of soldiers to fight off the South African offensive. And since then, the combined forces of South Africa and its colonial allies, the US and the UK, had been backing a brutal insurgent movement called UNITA. Those of you who play Call of Duty may be familiar with UNITA and its leader Jonas Savimbi. But in 1987, South Africa launched a new offensive against the MPLA government in Angola. And once again, Cuba sent thousands of troops to aid the MPLA in their defense of the country. This was actually the biggest commitment of South African troops since World War II, so really significant. And yet the offensive was beaten back in March 1988 by the MPLA and their Cuban allies, and was widely seen as a humiliating defeat for South Africa. Now, the defeat of South Africa, at the name of the place, the name of the battle was Cuito, Cuanavale. Sorry if I've pronounced that wrong. It's spelled Cuito, Cuanavale, Battle of Cuito, Cuanavale. It was of massive significance. Again, not really touched on properly, in my opinion, in your textbooks, and indeed in more broader conventional Western readings of South Africa. But its significance was acknowledged by the ANC. And I just want to read you some quotes from Nelson Mandela in this regard. So, the very first country Mandela visited following his release from prison in 1990 was Cuba. And he went there to show his gratitude for the unstinting support Cuba had always given to the anti-apartheid struggle. And in particular, their decisive role in defeating South African forces in Angola in 1988. Over 2,000 Cuban soldiers were actually killed fighting in Angola between 75 and 88, by the way. And in his speech in front of thousands of Cubans, Mandela described the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale as, quote, a turning point for the liberation of our continent and my people. He said, quote, the defeat of the apartheid army served as an inspiration to the struggling people of South Africa. The decisive defeat of the aggressive apartheid forces destroyed the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressor. That's really important. That's the bit of the quote you should write down, really, that it destroyed the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressor. Echoes of Steve Biko there. Let's think about what he means by that. Remember the classic quote from Steve Biko? The greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. By which Biko meant that the biggest obstacle to liberation is the belief amongst oppressed people that they can't win, that the white oppressor is too strong. In other words, the lack of confidence and self-belief that Biko believed black people in South Africa had due to decades of colonialism and then apartheid and so on. This lack of confidence and self-belief in their own ability to fight and win. That's the biggest obstacle to liberation. That's what Biko meant in his quote. Now what Mandela is saying here is that seeing the mighty South African white army being humbled and defeated at the hands of just independently organized black people, of independent black freedom fighters, was an incredibly liberating thing to witness. It proved it could be done. It freed the minds of the oppressed. Suddenly the question, oh, but could we ever beat them? It was no longer a theoretical question. It had been answered in practice, positively. Yes, we can, and we have done. So let me read on from Mandela. He went on, quote, "The decisive defeat of the racist army in Cuito, Cuanavale was a victory for all Africa. This victory in Cuito, Cuanavale is what made it possible for Angola to enjoy peace and establish its own sovereignty. The defeat of the racist army made it possible for the people of Namibia to achieve their independence." End quote. So what he's referring to here is that following this defeat, South Africa was basically forced to negotiate an exit from not only Angola but also Namibia. Their defeat in Angola made them realize there was no military solution to their problems. They were pouring money into their military operations in Namibia and Angola, money they increasingly didn't have due to trade sanctions, and that Western banks are increasingly unwilling to lend them. They already had conscription, and there was actually a huge youth movement against conscription. So white people were all increasingly unwilling to fight and die for the defense of apartheid. There was a movement called the End Conscription Campaign that was launched in 1984, and tens of thousands of young white people dodged the draft and hid out in the bush, sometimes even joined the black liberation forces themselves. So really what Mandela's saying is that this defeat basically, it sort of demonstrated that you're not going to win by force. Similar to what happened with the townships. The army couldn't regain control, couldn't impose their will on the townships. And the military couldn't impose their will on Angola. So they had to pull out of Angola, pull out of Namibia. And this was massively confidence-inspiring to the anti-apartheid resistance and kind of demoralizing for the supporters of just apartheid by any means, just crush them. They tried and failed. And there'd also been so again, it kind of demonstrated that, you know, remember there was this argument, right, in white society in the 80s. How do we deal with this resistance? How do we reimpose order and stability on the country? And on the one hand, people were saying crush, repress, military, stamp them out. On the other hand, people were saying maybe we need to negotiate an end to apartheid. And really, the proponents of that first view, like they had a go at crushing and they failed. It was like there was no military solution to this thing, and that's what Cuito Cuanavale demonstrated. There'd also been a similar situation in Mozambique. This is a kind of a footnote here, bracketed, just to fill you in on this history. In Mozambique, where another black radical, basically communist movement, Frelimo, had come to power in 1975 after forcing out the Portuguese. And here too, a brutal insurgent group, Renamo, was trained and funded by South Africa, the US and the UK to fight against this new black radical socialist government. And the country was repeatedly subjected to aerial bombardment by the South African Air Force. But unlike Angola and Namibia, Mozambique was essentially terrorized into submission. And in 1984, they signed a peace agreement with South Africa, agreeing to throw out ANC bases in their country. So they were kind of out of the picture by the second half of the 1980s. Okay, so let's bring this all together. We've looked at our three factors: the pressure domestically from those four forces, the regional battles going on, and then the international pressure through sanctions and divestment. So let's put this all together. By the second half of the 1980s, then, the combined impact of all of this, that is the resistance domestically and across the region, and its international repercussions in terms of sanctions and divestment, was that this period was really a period of total crisis for the National Party and for the white population in general. And there seemed to be no way out. Many by now realized apartheid could not continue. All it offered was permanent domestic unrest and civil war, near civil war conditions, international isolation and economic crisis. Yet, white South Africans were still terrified that if apartheid was abandoned and if the black majority got the vote, then the ANC would come to power. And if the ANC came to power, backed by the Soviet Union, which still existed in the 80s, the big fear was that they would implement a socialist economic policy, redistribute land, nationalize wealth, and the whites would lose everything. So they were stuck, and they were completely divided over what to do. And whereas once the National Party had enjoyed the support of an ever-growing majority of the white population, right up until the mid to late 70s, with every election, the National Party was increasing their share of the vote. But now voters were split three ways between the breakaway Conservative Party, the hardliners who wanted to push on with apartheid, step up repression. They became the second biggest party in Parliament, by the way, in 1987. So a serious threat to the National Party. It became the official opposition. The Progressive Party, who wanted a negotiated end to apartheid, and the National Party, who seemed kind of torn between the two. And what in the end the ANC offered the National Party was basically a straight deal. If the whites agreed to give up their political privileges, that is the white monopoly on voting, if they would, in other words, agree to a universal adult franchise and thereby hand over political power to the black majority, then on their part the ANC would guarantee to restore stability to the country. They would end the armed struggle, they would call on the black youth to end their uprisings and return to school and so on, and crucially, they would not embark on any radical socialist policies of redistribution. In other words, they would basically allow wealthy whites to keep their property. Just a footnote here, if you're interested in this kind of aspect of the deal, which a lot of people accuse the ANC of being sellouts, really. Although a lot of people say, it was very wise and they prevented the country just lapsing into all-out civil war. There's a great documentary called Apartheid Did Not End by John Pilger. Obviously the thesis is clear from the title, but that's worth a look, about kind of what happened after the ANC came to power and the kind of compromises they made with white power, and particularly that refusal to really touch white wealth. So the white population, the wealthy whites, hung on to the land that they'd stolen during the colonial and apartheid period. They hung on to their ownership of the mines in the main, and etc., etc. So the ANC, in other words, reassured the National Party that ANC rule would not mean South Africa would become a radical communist state, as they feared. Far from it. The ANC would rather oversee a restoration of capitalist stability, and that was the basic deal that was reached. So, in conclusion, bringing this all together, the National Party agreed to, firstly, enter negotiations with the ANC, and secondly, actually negotiate an end to apartheid, because three factors combined to make the continuation of apartheid untenable. International pressure in the forms of sanctions and divestment wrecked the economic stability on which white prosperity relied, and as an economy fundamentally reliant on exports, the loss of its main trading partner and number one ally, the USA, was not something it could simply ride out. And the USA made it clear that only the granting of political rights to the black population would restore the stability that was their condition for lifting the sanctions. But all of this only came about. So I've lost my place here. All of this only came about due to the resistance within South Africa itself. Sanctions and divestment, however they were dressed up, were not primarily a moral decision, but a financial one. Apartheid, after all, had been a moral abomination since its inception. What was new was that the combined efforts of the trade unions, especially under COSATU from 1985, the mass resistance led by the UDF from 1983, and the armed struggle being waged by MK meant that the political and economic stability of the country was being undermined, as never before. Profits were being threatened. Because once a government can no longer control its citizens, a country is not really a safe place to invest. And the reason I say the township uprisings were so crucial is because once a government has lost control over key parts of its territory, it actually calls into question its right to even call itself the government. If it cannot impose its rule across important swathes of the country, then we're really entering into a civil war situation. And that was what, more than anything, in my opinion, led the banks and the USA to pull out. The victories against the South African army in Angola and Namibia just hammered the point home. If South Africa could not impose its will through military force, if it could not bomb, kill and repress its way to stability, then what was left? Only a negotiated settlement, only an end to apartheid. Now, there's much more to say about the final years of apartheid, and you need to make sure you know about the COSATU negotiations, the sunset clause and all of that, what was happening in the homelands to an extent. And the best source for all of that, in my opinion, is the incredible 3-part documentary series, The Death of Apartheid, which I'll post the link to in the video description. But I hope what I've outlined here is how these 3 sets of factors, the domestic resistance, the regional resistance, and international pressure, all came together to create an irresistible pressure to end apartheid, to which even the National Party eventually had to succumb. Okay, thank you for listening. Good luck with your studies, and I hope you've found something of use in this lecture.